Hi, I'm here with Andrew Holt. I'm Dr. David Sheffler from the History Department at UNF. I'm the new chair there, and Dr. Andrew Holt is a professor at FSCJ in history with a focus on medieval studies, I know, for most of your research.
Yes.
As a fellow medievalist, I was invited here to ask him a few questions. First of all, what drew you to medieval studies generally? How is it you become a medievalist? Not many people sort of set out from the crib to become a medievalist. Yeah.
Well, of course, as we know, medievalists come into this profession for a variety of reasons, and of course, and I think a lot of medievalists who hear this my reasons for it will recognize some similarities, but there are some differences, perhaps. My interest in pursuing medieval studies in graduate school came when I was taking coursework at the University of North Florida, a wonderful institution, which we'll talk about more. And specifically, my interest in the Crusades happened in the fall term of 2001. I was taking a course on the Crusades at the time with Professor Paul Halsell, and of course that was when 9/11 happened. And the whole class, our interest was driven sky high as a result. And you can imagine the discussions and the atmosphere on campus and these sorts of things. And at the time, I recall reading a lot in the media and also reading a number of books. And I remember Osama bin Laden was constantly referring to Westerners as crusaders. And there was this whole sort of narrative, it seemed, within the propaganda that was used. And so that fascinated my study. I was also a former Marine from a Catholic background, and as someone with a Catholic background, a former Marine, you think about religion and violence at times. You can't help but think about it, It's and so studying the Crusaders, that was an interesting time for me. All these things combined. It was also, and finally I'll say, I was introduced to the works of Jonathan Riley Smith, the late Cambridge historian, University of Cambridge historian, who revolutionized, of course, Crusade studies over the last 30 years or so, maybe a dozen or more books, and many of them considered among the most important in modern historiography. And so, anyways, this combination of things came together for me, and I was dreadfully tired of my old corporate job, and my wife was willing to make the commitment for me to transition, and so I completed my AA degree here at FSCJ, and then my bachelor's and my master's at UNF, and then on for a PhD at the University of Florida. So.
You mentioned Riley Smith as one of the figures that's sort of formative in the way in which you came to think about the Crusades.
Sure.
What insights do you think that he brought to this question that were most important to the way that you have come to see the Crusades and the crusading movement?
Well, his focus on motivations, as it related to the Crusaders who participated in the First Crusade, I think was what was really groundbreaking. That, and as well as this focus on the penitential aspects of crusading. These were very important elements of his work. He actually went to the charters of those who participated in the Crusades, and he researched them, apparently hundreds of them from what I can tell, looking through his works. And he wanted to see what these knights in the late 11th century were writing about, why they were doing this, why they were going through the hardship of mortgaging lands and properties and selling things so they could fund themselves to go on this military mission for 2 or 3 years across continents. And he kept coming back over and over and over again to this penitential aspect of crusading and some other themes, a defense of Christians in the East who were suffering attacks from Turks and so on. But I thought his focus on this particular type of source, rather than the standard clerical sources, rather than what popes had written and so on, was quite fascinating. And that's what everyone else has found interesting for that matter as well.
Yeah,
so.
I think the aspect of taking religion seriously within this context, rather than seeing it as kind of window dressing.
Absolutely, you're right. There was a certain cynicism that existed maybe from Runciman, the period of historian Stephen Runciman writing in the 1950s onward. And this was carried on by historians like the French scholar Georges Duby, who had argued that he had found sources for one family. And he made the argument that the Crusades were a great outlet for second sons who wouldn't inherit land. And so these families needed something to do with these second sons, these rowdy young knights. And so why not send them off to the Holy Land on a crusade? And so everybody in the 70s seemed to adopt Dewey's argument, and all of a sudden the Crusades became all about financial gain, economic motives. But then Riley Smith came along, and he looked at hundreds of charters, and not just for one. And he said, no, this is silly. And first sons participated more than second sons, and a whole host of other fascinating arguments. And it was interesting learning and reading about these kind of debates and the motivations of those who took part.
So as a professor at UNF, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about your experiences at UNF and how that helped prepare you for your doctoral program. And in the interest of full disclosure here, Andrew Holt was my very first graduate TA, or one of my first four.
Proudly so, absolutely.
We referred to that group affectionately as the Dream Team, so I'm not entirely unbiased in my assessment of your career as it's progressed.
Well, thank you.
If you could.
Well, I've had great mentors, of course. So let me talk about UNF though. Absolutely, I'm a big fan of the University of North Florida. I think in terms of history programs, or really almost any programs, when we talk about northeastern Florida, a population base of 1.5 million people, this is it's the real deal. It's the big game in town for those upper level programs. When I was there. I had a history department with 16 or 17 faculty members, all of them with doctorates, many of them from Ivy League schools. I mean, how many professors do you have now that have graduated at least one of their degrees from, an Ivy League school? At least half, two-thirds, yeah. And many of them with PhDs. Or Wisconsin, which is an excellent school, one of the top-rated, public institutions. And also I remember at one point UNF's history department had outpublished, if I remember correctly, if I'm saying this correctly, FSU's. But I'd want to confirm that, I suppose, We should double check that, yeah, absolutely. But even if that's not the case, certainly the UNF historians have been energetic and really done a lot of great work, a lot of great research. And so to be able to go there and take 30 credit hours from all these brilliant, historians who had published all these great books, and then to do a master's degree program and serve as a teaching assistant and learn from, these wonderful historians. And then also I should mention the study abroads, I got to spend summers in Europe, France, Spain, Portugal, studying medieval history. I got to go to Turkey to study Byzantine history. It was a wonderful experience for Northeast Florida. Where else are you going to get that kind of action in Northeast Florida, right? And then this, of course, laid the foundation for me to go on to UF at the University of Florida and work on a PhD there. And I felt from the moment I got there that I was as competitive as anybody else in that program. And it was relatively competitive. They have 150 applications each year. They only accept maybe 30, and they only fund about 10 or 12 of those. But I got funding, and like I said, I didn't feel like I skipped a beat. I felt like UNF had prepared me wonderfully for doctoral level studies. So I can't say enough good things about UNF, as you know, David.
Well, I'm going to try to prod you to say a few good things about it.
Absolutely.
You mentioned the study abroad. Is there one particular trip or one particular episode that
stands
out, some moment in your travels that maybe put you on the way towards your doctoral studies or confirmed your interest in history?
Well, the trip to Turkey to study Byzantine history was absolutely fascinating. I had been reading Procopius, the 6th century Byzantine historian.
Good read.
And then when I entered Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral that was a mosque and today is a museum, that was rebuilt, I should say, in the 6th century, that line from Procopius came back to me. I walked in and I saw this amazing, structure, this enormous structure, and I thought of that famous line, "Oh Solomon, I've outdone you," and I thought, wow, I'm really experiencing this firsthand. And
I have a different line from Procopius memorized.
There are a few, aren't there? So, absolutely. Procopius also wrote a secret history, we should say, that had all the dirt and gossip. But getting back, though, to your question, but of course, we also traced a little bit of the way of St. James at one point from France into Spain and another study abroad. And I know you lead these masterful study abroad expeditions, and I hope our students would get involved in those and go off to Europe and study with you over the summer. It's a great way to get all these credit hours. And so, you know, when I have students here at FSCJ, and if they express any inkling in history, you know, I want to talk to them and I want to explain to them. And one final thing I should say, UNF offers a master's degree in history where if students qualify for it, they can become teaching assistants, which I was. And it'll pay their tuition, or most of it at least. It will also offer them opportunities to go on study abroads as a teaching assistant, and at least it did when I was, you know, there. And then you can complete your master's degree, mostly debt-free, but also have 2 years of college-level teaching experience, leading these discussion sections on Friday morning with college freshmen. And so it's a wonderful sort of bang for your buck, you know, but in addition to that, it's a wonderful experience to really start to learn about graduate-level history and the processes involved and what historians actually do. And so, you know.
So shifting gears a little bit
sure.
Away from plugging my university, we'll move to your book, which came out in 2015 on 7 myths of the Crusades. I'm wondering if you could kind of talk about maybe the beginnings of that book. I think I was in on some of the earliest conversations.
You were.
I can remember where I was.
Going back to UNF again, I was actually in a graduate seminar with Professor Michael Francis, who's now at the University of South Florida, I believe. And I read his book by Matthew Restall, 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest. And I thought it was a brilliant little book, and it dispelled all these myths that I had believed about the Spanish conquest. And then I started thinking about my own area of interest, the Crusades, and how I'd been learning all this stuff in Riley Smith that was so at odds with what, you know, with popular assumptions about crusading. And so here I was, a humble MA graduate student at the University of North Florida, you know, with a dream, as they say. But of course, no press would be interested in a graduate student at that level, no academic press. But I was encouraged. I think we had discussions and to at least pursue it, you know, in a rational way, and also encouraged to maybe consider speaking with a senior historian that might team up with me, one that had the reputation, the credibility, the career, all those things an academic publisher was looking for. And so I think it was 2008 at the St. Louis Crusades conference at the University of St. Louis, Thomas Madden organized. I saw retired senior scholar Alfred J. Andrea, who's written a number of books, some of them on the Crusades, some of them on world history. He recently edited a 21-volume encyclopedia of world history, former president of the world history. I mean, great credentials. And he was sitting there eating breakfast, and I meekly approached him, you know, and I sat down. I invited myself, and he looked a little suspicious at first, but he was kind, and I said, you know, I've got an idea, and I want to run it by you. And so I gave him this whole spiel, and he patiently sat there listening while he was eating his breakfast, and he said, well, let's talk more about it. And then from there, you know, we developed this dialogue, and he was kind enough, and you know, with his scholarly credentials, any press would take a serious look, and so it was wonderful of Al, who's now my good friend, you know, to have considered this in this way. But of course, he was in the middle of editing a 21-volume encyclopedia. I had a PhD to do. I was just beginning it, including a dissertation, and so it took a while before we finally, a number of major historians were intrigued by the project and wanted to sign on to it and did at one point or another, but we took so long that many of them moved on to other projects, you know, and so that was one of the things.
Well, you were editing some massive encyclopedia too, at least some portion of.
I had another co-edited volume with another great historian, James Muldoon. It was the same while I was in graduate school, and it was the same approach. You know, I was the grad student without the credentials, and so these wonderful senior historians would sign on. And it was a tremendous learning experience working under their tutelage, you know. And so to Jim Muldoon and Al Andrea, I'll always be grateful. grateful. But those were both experiences that I had while in graduate school. And then later, my advisor, one of my best friends, Florin Curta from the University of Florida, he agreed to do a 3-volume encyclopedia on pivotal events in religious history. And so that was a major project that consumed my years immediately after I graduated with my doctorate in 2013. So I was finally free of that, and I immediately signed up to do another one all on my own. And I don't know if that was the best move, but we're plugging along, and we'll get there.
So you've got a lot of experience working with a variety of publishers.
Yes, well, on some level I do, absolutely. Remember, I got my PhD in 2013, so I'm still very much a junior scholar, and so I still very much feel like I'm learning. I'm just learning, and I want to keep that approach. I don't ever want to think I actually know something, because then I'll probably be in trouble. But yeah. So.
And the Myths of the Crusade is published with Hackett, correct?
Hackett Publishing, and they're absolutely wonderful. Al and I had a lot to put together, and once we approached Hackett about it, Rick Todhunter, their senior editor there, who's absolutely wonderful, took real interest in the work, and he helped us shepherd it through to completion. He was very supportive, and I'm impressed with him. He treats his authors wonderfully. He liked the idea so much that we developed, with his encouragement, a series with Hackett Publishing, Myths of History. And we've recently published 2 additional books in the series, The 7 Myths of the Civil War.
And with the professor who teaches here
with Dr. Wesley Moody, who teaches here at FSCJ. And then also we published a book on the myths of Africa in world history, and we have books on Native Americans coming out, one on medieval Europe, but others as well under contract. And the goal is that these books are presented in a way that hopefully they'll be appealing to undergraduates for use in the classroom, that they'll be affordable. There are both hardbacks, which are expensive, but there's also these convenient paperbacks, which are only $19, and so they probably shouldn't cost students too many anxieties, And we've recruited some wonderful historians for these other books, which we can get to at some other time. But the series is coming along nicely, and we think it's going to be popular for use in a lot of history classrooms.
So just focusing on the 7 myths,
Yeah.
7 Myths of the Crusades
Sure.
that came out in 2015, what issues do you take on? What are the kind of most important
Sure.
contributions do you think that work ultimately makes?
Well, with the 7 myths that we have here, and I have it open to the table of contents here, just to make sure I don't slip, we recruited Paul F. Crawford, a wonderful Crusade historian. Most Americans will have seen him on the History Channel or Discovery Channel or various specials. He's appeared in a number of television programs on the Crusades, and he wrote the first chapter, which has to do with the myth that the Crusaders attack a peaceful Muslim world. The actual title of his chapter is The First Crusade, Unprovoked Defense or Overdue Defense. And this is perhaps the most controversial of all the chapters in the book, and has been received that way in some ways. But what Paul was pointing out is something that Crusade historians have long known, is that, the Crusaders, when they go off to the Holy Land, it's in large part because Eastern Christians are asking them for help. Pope Gregory VII, 20 years earlier, had considered a sort of proto-crusade where he called on 50,000 Western Knights to go to the aid of Eastern Christians. This was the way they had framed it. And Peter Frankopan at Oxford University has recently published a book really highlighting these extensive efforts on the part of Eastern Christians to recruit Western military aid. And so there's a lot going on in the 20 years or so before the First Crusade is called. Christian cities like Nicaea, where the great Christian church councils were held in the 4th and 8th centuries. Christian cities like Antioch, where Christians first got the title Christian, was bestowed on them as a form of derision. These are cities that are conquered in the 1080s. And so there's this sort of outcry from the East, and much of it's very propagandistic in the way it's framed, really extraordinary claims, and it's meant to stir up sympathy in the West. And whether all those claims are, 100% defensible is debated sometimes. But nevertheless, scholars like Frankopan and others, and Andrew Jatishki and some others think that there's real legitimacy, And so Crawford points this out. It's not just a bunch of sort of zealous, mad crusaders that march off to the Holy Land in pursuit of, a sort of fanatic glory or something. In fact, they take, which delves into the second myth, James Muldoon's. There's a lot of planning, a lot of thought. There's a development of canon law to justify crusading. And so these aren't just sort of frenzied madmen that are rushing off to war with real religious zealotry. They're waiting for crops to come in, before they leave, and in most cases. And so Jim Muldoon picks up on that theme, Madmen on Crusade, Religious Madness and the Origins of the First Crusade. And he considers very carefully the rationality of the Crusaders, and he dispels a lot of these sort of popular assumptions about these things. The third chapter is by a friend of mine, Daniel Frank, a talented military historian who was teaching at West Point for a few years before he's recently settled in to a new college, to a tenure track position. The Crusades and medieval anti-Judaism, cause or consequence. And he takes what he calls a triangular approach to this issue, because during the First Crusade, some of the worst violence against Jews took place in medieval European history. These attacks, there was some crusaders who had set out early, had attacked Jewish communities in the Rhineland and elsewhere, and their rationale seems to have effectively been, if we're going to fight the infidels in the Holy Land, maybe we should fight them at home, But this wasn't sanctioned, of course. It's not like the Pope said anything about attacking Jews. And in fact, many Crusade leaders, secular leaders, the emperor at the time, the Pope at the time, were upset with these attacks. They saw them as diversions. In other words, Crusades weren't supposed to be, at least from the top down, about attacking Jews. But some critics will argue that the excitement, the enthusiasm of the crusading era contributes to this. It stirs this up. And so Daniel Frank takes a very measured look at these complex issues, and he triangulates, as he puts it. He takes three positions on this, and he triangulates to see, to arrive at what he feels are, very reasonable conclusions, what we can say and can't say about this. Number 4, The Quest for Gain, were the First Crusaders Proto-Colonists by Corliss Slack. And Corliss is a wonderful historian who looked at this issue. To what degree did economic gain factor into the Crusaders' motivations? Were they colonists? Because they do set up Crusader states, four major states with the First Crusade. And she rejects some of these popular assumptions about this. I mean, the Crusaders aren't 19th century imperialists in any modern sense of the term. The Crusader states were massively expensive. They were depopulated. Scholars like Christopher McKeevick at Dartmouth University have pointed out how they even ruled with a certain, as he calls it, rough tolerance, because they were so anxious to make sure their states were populated. How can you rule a Crusader state if nobody lives there, right? And so they had large populations of Muslims and Jews and Eastern Christians and others. And so it's a very different type of scenario, and most historians today have sort of rejected associations with modern colonialism. But correct me if because you know these arguments well, David, and this is a short interview, and if I overstep, don't be shy about coming in. But something else Corliss looks at also is the notion that material gain is what drove the Crusaders, and she once again goes back to the same arguments that I mentioned earlier about Riley Smith and the charters. One historian, John Francis, estimated that on the First Crusade there was a 75% casualty rate. It was entirely voluntary, and these were people who knew the hardships of crusading. If you've got to walk on foot across continents and fight armies all the way through and fund it all yourself and have your mom mortgage your house to do it, this isn't an easy thing, to do. And it bankrupted many crusaders, and it caused great financial havoc. And that's the one thing they're stressed out about in their charters, is the costs of crusading.
All of their affairs in order.
Exactly. And so a lot of property has to be accounted for, mortgaged, pawned, I guess, and so on, or sold. Yeah. And then of course the fifth myth is one. I wonder who wrote the fifth one. Maybe you could remind me. Was that?
I think I might have contributed
I think that's right. It was David Sheffler, chair of the history department at the University of North Florida. A wonderful essay on the Children's Crusade. What was the Children's Crusade? I love how you began your essay, because you start with a survey of your students in your class, and you ask them what was the Children's Crusade, and one responded along the lines of, isn't that the Kids' Crusade where they all got killed or something like that? And this has been a topic of derision of the Crusaders for a long time, because particularly, I suppose, in the Enlightenment and post the Reformation.
I was particularly critical of this aspect.
Absolutely, you're the expert, so yeah. But this idea that the Crusades were so terrible that they sent their kids off, and they all get enslaved in North Africa or whatever the case, you know. And but it's much more complex than that. A lot of it is probably literary. There's some issue about the actual age of the Children's Crusade. I realize that scholars have decided they definitely were younger, you know, as you point out. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're 6-year-olds, right? I mean, this could be. So there's different ways of interpreting this. But it's a fascinating chapter, and I encourage everyone to read it. I'm sitting here taking so long. The Templars and Masons, an Origin Myth by Jace Stuckey, another Crusade historian who studied under my advisor, Florin Curta. Jace writes about the Templars, and you know, there's few people, there's few organizations that more conspiracy theories swirl around than the Templars. Umberto Eco, I think, famously said that you can tell a madman by the fact that he eventually brings up the Templars, you know, and whether it's the free
Undergraduate student, actually.
or an undergraduate student, yes, you're right, but the from the Freemasons claiming a lineage with the Templars to you know, Dan Brown novels and these elaborate stories of the Templars, Jace takes on a lot of these myths and just argues that it's all myth, you know, that there just isn't any historical connection between these different groups. And then finally, one of the most controversial chapters, perhaps second after Paul Crawford's, is the one by Edward Peters at the University of Pennsylvania, retired professor emeritus, and his former graduate student, Mona Hamad, who teaches in Jordan, and they looked at the modern Muslim memory of the Crusades. How do modern Muslims understand the Crusades as a historical event? And in large part, it's seen as a period of victimization, where Westerners were traveling to the Holy Land and inflicting all this violence on them. And but they point out very clearly that that's largely an invented memory that begins in the late 19th, early 20th century, really, in an age of modern imperialism, when the Western world is active in the Middle East. You see Ottoman leaders, for example, making comparisons of their plight with, you know, events in the 12th century, and so on, and that most Muslim histories could care less about the Crusades, because historically there's a triumphalist view of history of the Muslim past. In other words, you know, perhaps 2/3 of the Christian world, for example, is conquered by Muslim armies prior to the First Crusade. Then you have a 2-century period of crusading, but then after that you have the Ottoman push into Europe. And so there's a lot of military success, or from the point of view of some Muslim writers, military glory even, as there's all these conquests and victories. And yet inserted right in the middle of it is these Crusades, you know. And so a lot of these histories would gloss right over the Crusades. But then in the 19th and early 20th century, at a time of weakness in the Islamic world, a new...
In
terms of politics. In terms of politics, and well, also there's Western European colonial powers that are inserting themselves in these affairs and so on. There's a new narrative that emerges that the Crusades are the beginning of this sort of thing, without addressing, you know, Islamic imperialism, you know, which existed on a pretty large scale in the Middle Ages and early modern period. And so anyways, Dr. Peters and Dr. Hamad look at modern sources. Dr. Hamad knows Arabic fluently, of course, And they write a fascinating chapter about the invention of this modern Muslim memory of the Crusades. So anyways, that's a mouthful. But we cover a whole host of other myths in the introduction, and you can imagine this is a complex book, and we're trying to keep it all, each chapter short and digestible, 20 pages roughly each, so that undergrads who don't have this background can come in and read this and understand, you know, what the historiographical arguments are, where they're at currently. And so that was the goal.
Yeah. And you mentioned the two sort of controversial chapters, Paul Crawford and then Templars and Hamad's contributions.
Yeah.
What were the most controversial aspects of maybe the Peters Hamad article particularly?
Oh, well, you know, I don't know specifically of any complaints that were directed at me about that chapter, but the reason I would say it's among the most controversial is because it flies in the face of so much of what's said in the broader Islamic world. I was going to say the Arab world. You often hear the Arab street and so on, but really within the Turkish world as well, and so on.
Well, even Indonesia actually has developed stories about the Crusades that reflect some of these ideas.
No, absolutely. And so when you have Western Crusade historians saying that this narrative is wrong, and by the way, I should mention that this narrative of victimization, you know, is one that many scholars have embraced. Whether we're talking about Al-Azhar University in Egypt, you know, one of the oldest seats of learning, higher learning in the Islamic world, dating back to the 10th century, something like that, or even modern scholars, you know, at prestigious universities. Many have embraced this, and so here you have Ed Peters and Mona Hamad that are saying, no, this is all invented. You know, this is late 19th, early 20th century. It's sort of a new history in that sense. Well, what's concerning about that is that it's that same history that the radical groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Al-Shabaab in Africa, they embrace that history, that language, that rhetoric. I read an interview once with Osama bin Laden, and it was a short, maybe 2 pages if you printed it out, and there was something like 14 references to Westerners as crusaders, you know. And so this is a dangerous narrative in that sense, in that it's used to recruit and to foster animosity towards the West. But on top of it, it's a false narrative, which is all the more distressing in that, you know, in the post 9/11 world, in the age of the war on terror, right, and these kind of conflicts. You're seeing these narratives perpetuated. And so in a way, some of these chapters are meant to respond to that. But of course, we have far less controversial chapters on, you know, Templars and Children's Crusade and so on. So, but we do want to touch on some of these things. I mean, this book could have had 30 myths, but we had to narrow it down somehow. So
given some of these false narratives that have developed over time, do you think that gives historians a particular responsibility or a particular role to play in addressing them?
A moral responsibility. I still view myself as much as humanly possible, and I know there are critics of this, as Ronchian in my view, and anyone who studied history knows that I'm referring to von Ranke, this great German historiographical figure, in that I think we should write history, quote unquote, as it was, at least so much as the sources will allow us, so much as our own biases will allow us. You know, we should try to control for them as best we can. And so I'm not very much into, so the thing is, like, if we talk about activist history, I don't know if that's so much the direction I want to go with this. What I want to do is write history as it was, you know, I mean, as much as possible, as much as sources and our own implicit biases will allow, to be careful. But then once we've produced that narrative, you know, most historians stand back. We're not responsible with what others do with it. And there are others who will take these narratives and use them for modern political purposes of all stripes, which we won't get into, but of all stripes. And but in the case of you know, when we talk about Islamic extremism, since this was something that I've been called to comment on publicly, I was sort of forced, you know, to bring in my historical background. As a Crusade historian, I was once invited to give an interview for local media, and I was supposed to give some historical background, and that snowballed into nearly 50, you know, local interviews where the conversation could cover anything, and I quickly realized, but I did have that historical background as a base for commentary and for discussion, and so in that sense, I started, worrying about the production of history and how it's used. I don't know. I mean, I'd have to think about this more. It's a good question.
Well, it's a big...
it is a big topic.
It's a big question and a kind of a difficult box to unpack.
Thanks for asking that question, Dave.
So, in general, though, you think the book has been well received?
It has.
Scholars in the field?
There were some wonderful, the press, when it was originally done, sent it out to readers, and they liked the responses, and so Hackett seemed to send it out to some more readers. And we probably had 7 or 8 readers read it, and many of them were top-level Crusade historians, some of the best in the field. Malcolm Barber, for example, referred to it as an important book, for dispelling myths. Alan Murray at Leeds University, one of the great modern Crusade historians, said it was essential reading for journalists who write about the Crusades. And a host of others, have commented very well on it. The only sort of mild, critical, I guess, review we had was one from Christopher Tyerman, but I felt like, who is one of the great, he's a historian that I respect enormously, God's War, this 1,000-page, fantastic work on the Crusades. But his criticism was more along the lines of that it seemed more like a manual for how did he put it, for condemning error, or something like a medieval heretics manual or something. But by that, what he meant is that it didn't seem as focused on the neophyte historian, the undergraduate. It could perhaps, but others disagreed with him, and so, I encourage anybody to read it for themselves and see what they think.
Did you get the sense that the work, given the potentially controversial nature of at least some of the arguments that are made, and certainly of the topic generally, regardless of what position is taken on some of these questions, did it register in terms of some of the broader cultural controversies, or has it kind of remained within the field of Crusades historians?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I have gotten a number of comments from people, whether through social media or email, and I've also had lots of friend requests on Facebook from people who have read the book and so on. And there are some people who absolutely love it. On Amazon, it's been reviewed several times, and you can see how people are responding there. And so I do think that it's expanding beyond the normal scope of most academic books. There was a second print run, for example. The first print run had sold out. Yeah, and for academic books, how many copies might a serious, sober academic book sell?
Yeah, you're happy with 500.
500 or something. Yeah, and so this is comparatively, this is doing well.
My mother didn't read my book, so.
It took my wife years to read mine, so I'm with you. So comparatively, this is doing well, and that is the goal. I should mention that the idea is what we're trying to do is show that there are these popular assumptions about a historical topic, but those popular assumptions don't always line up with what historians are actually saying, and this is where historians are at, what we call historiography, where the current historiography is at the moment, and so each chapter is written to contrast those popular assumptions with the current scholarship on the matter. And if you want to say, oh, well, all the scholars are wrong, then fine, be my guest. But this is where scholarship is at the moment. And this can be controversial in the case of the Civil War, for example. If we talk about issues related to the U.S. Civil War, that's a hot button topic in the United States, but sometimes popular assumptions don't line up with where scholarship is. Well, similarly, the Crusades are another topic. So it's a snapshot, really, of where scholars are at on these issues. And that can change. I'm not saying scholars this is the final view on these things. It can change. We can dig up new sources. We can view through new interpretive lenses, depending on the time period or the context that we live in, and so on. But this is where we're at now. And I'm not saying that it's whimsical. I mean, this is based on decades of solid scholarship, of people who know the languages, can research the things in the original. And so that's strong, but it can change, over time.
So given your willingness to take on controversial topics, I think you've also been involved in some sort of visible blogging of late.
Yeah.
I wonder if you want to kind of address
Sure.
some of the issues that you take on in that blog, and maybe what contributions and how you see it contributing to the broader discourse about history or about politics.
It's the digital age, and historians.
I'm a medievalist. I don't.
I'm a medievalist too, but we are
After
getting
the printing press, there were no important inventions.
Well, that's how we used to think, but that's starting to change. There are, in an age of social media, a story written by a journalist about the Middle Age that can be riddled with errors, can be shared 100,000 times, or maybe 1 million, depending on who they're writing for. And guess what? Everybody adopts that view of that topic of the Middle Ages. And so at the time, I remember I was giving these local media interviews, as I mentioned before, and I would occasionally get an email from somebody locally or maybe somebody at the college, and they'd have a question. They'd want more information, or maybe they'd disagree, or maybe they'd politely disagree, or maybe they would agree, I don't know. But they'd want more information. And because I was great on the historical background, but I had to always study and prepare for the modern context, I would literally write up these essays at night, and I figured there's people asking for more information. I'm writing essay after essay. I might as well just make them available online. And that's essentially what I did. I polished them and started adding them to a blog. But then I also incorporated historical essays, on topics that interest me, and interesting people that I know. I would do profiles and ask them about controversial issues in some cases. And I started having fun. It became a hobby. And the first year, I think I had 5,000 readers, so not exactly a popular blog. But this year so far, I've got over 60,000 with a few months to go, and I just started it a few years ago. And as you were saying, historians, when we write books, how many people, read that book? And so social media and this new technology, there's a lot of debates. To what degree do current PhD students need to have a social, a presence online of some sort? And because the ones who are seem to have a broader audience, for their arguments, their ideas, and so on.
Do you think that the work that you do on that blog gets sort of washed away in all the stream of other kinds of commentaries and culture wars and all the other things that we see, or do you think it makes some sort of difference in the overall discourse?
I don't know. I think it makes some sort of difference to a small number of people who like to read it regularly, and who want to go to a historian. And the thing about it is, like, some event can happen that has a particular historical context that I'm familiar with, that I have expertise in, and so I can blog about it the next day, and maybe offer something that's worthwhile on that issue. Whereas if I tried to publish this with an academic press or something, how long would that take? It'd be a year and a half removed. I mean, yeah. And so it offers the public access to scholars, and there are a lot of academics who do this, But I'm not saying that a lot of people read mine. When I brought up 60,000, I wasn't bragging. There are academic blogs that have millions of readers. I'm very much a small fish, But still, that number is alarming when you consider what we normally reach in these discussions. So anyways, I can tell you though, with social media, Facebook pages, Twitter accounts, blogs, more and more PhD students are embracing this, and it's becoming a new way to start to shift discussions and conversations. And of course, the sober traditional historians who write those masterful works that influence, scholarly fields, don't go for that very much, and so a lot of times what I blog about is their work,
Well, there's sort of an interesting point that you're making here. On the one hand, we talked about, I asked you about whether or not you saw the historian as having a particular role, and yet here you are.
I know.
In this
Well, that's why I said I'd want to think about it. Because I think the production of history, just to clarify, I think the production of history should be done within that Ronchian bubble, as much as possible, and that's the qualifier, the important qualifier. But then once it's produced, and once it's a done matter, and you've written a book or you've produced scholarship, based on original sources and so on, then at that point, if you feel someone's misusing that scholarship, you have as much right as anybody else to say so.
To engage in that.
If you want to. Not that you have to, but if you want to. And don't think I engage everything. I don't. In nearly 3 years, I've published 96 blog posts. What's that come out to? Maybe 2.5, 3 a month. There are other people that blog every single day. And so I just occasionally, once every week or two, I write something up from my blog. So I just wouldn't have the time otherwise, But on some issues, I do want to,
Well, Andrew, it's always a pleasure. I want to thank you
absolutely.
for the conversation and wish you success on this book and on the rest of the series.
Well, thank you, David. Real joy to have you here. I appreciate it.